In the waning days of 1944, as Europe trembled on the edge of liberation, a quiet winter night in the Ardennes concealed a plan that would shock the Allied world. The German High Command, clinging to the last reserves of an exhausted army, sought not a single thrust, but a shaping blow. A battle of survival and surprise that would redefine the war's final chapters. They called it Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, Operation Watch on the Rhine. To the Allies, the name would come to signify a test of nerve, logistics, and endurance that few would forget. The year had begun with a grind of advance and counter-advance, with cities liberated and front lines redrawn in fire and dust. Yet by December 1944, the Allied momentum had slackened in a way that felt almost local, almost trivial. A snowstorm over the bleak forests of the Ardennes, a few miles of forest road, a handful of divisions, and a plan born more of desperation than of sheer strategic genius. It would be the largest and most audacious German offensive on the Western Front, a surprise attack that would dare to strike through the liminal space between victory and exhaustion, between the front lines and the quiet, intimate horror of winter war. The battlefield was the Ardennes, a landscape many thought had been exhausted as a theater of war, a rolling mosaic of oak and beech, hedgerows and narrow valleys, strewn with the debris of a long conflict. The geography, dense woods, uncertain roads, and a few critical supply hubs made this a theater where deception could flourish and where the enemy could slip through gaps that appear only to those who know where to look. The German plan rested on a dangerous premise, that Allied intelligence would misread a thrust into the Ardennes as a localized counterattack, not the brink of a continental-scale operation. But the arc of any war is not drawn by maps alone. It is drawn by feet that march, hands that wrench a machine back to life in the cold, and minds that must improvise when the weather or the weather of history tests every decision. The battle would be fought in forests and farms, towns and cross-country corridors, in the fevered breath between fear and resolve. What follows is not a simple chronicle of troop movements, but a portrait of a moment when two nations, equally committed to their own destinies, collided in a storm of snow and steel. It is the story of armored columns grinding against a determined defense, of supply lines that stretched thinner with every mile, of weather that betrayed and sometimes blessed the fighters below. It is a story that asks not just how a battle was fought, but what it revealed about leadership, endurance, and the costs of war when the ordinary becomes extraordinary. From the first cannon shot to the last radio message, from the first reconnaissance patrol to a battlefield decision that altered the map, the Battle of the Bulge was a crucible. It tested the Allied ability to absorb a sophisticated, well-timed counteroffensive. It tested German nerve, logistics, and the stubborn will to live and fight another day. And it pressed civilians into service, fear, and endurance that would outlive the war's immediate outcomes. But history is not only about the clash of steel. It's about the people who bear its weight, the infantryman in a rain of snow, the jeep driver who keeps moving when the engine falters, the medic who races under shell fire to reach a wounded comrade, the home front listening in fear and waiting for a sign of return. The Bulge would imprint itself on memory because it fused strategic stakes with intimate moments of risk and resilience. To understand this battle, we must begin with what came before, the Allied advance from the D-Day beaches to the heart of Western Europe, and the German decision to gamble on a winter offensive that could disrupt the Allied timetable and force a negotiation under terms favorable to Berlin. We must also consider the weather, a constant antagonist, and at times an improbable ally. The cold that numbs fingers and crowds the lungs, the snow that hides tracks and reveals nothing, the wind that carries the roar and the tremor of mechanized warfare. The battle would unfold in a series of movements, counter-movements, and staccato bursts of engagement, a German spearhead driven through the Ardennes, a rapid Allied counterthrust, a widening of the front as reserves arrive, and a race to contain breakthroughs before they can reshape the entire strategic landscape. It is a story of improvisation, of commanders who must adapt to fog and fire, of soldiers who press on when supplies run short, and of civilians who live inside a war that does not end with a single victory, but with a long, cumulative cost. As in all great conflicts, the Battle of the Bulge was not merely a clash of scores and maps. It was a test of character, a test of supply chains and decision time, a test of faith, faith in a cause, faith in comrades, and a faith that daylight will return after the longest night. The narrative you're about to hear is not a single thread, but a tapestry woven from strategic intent, battlefield reality, and human resilience. It moves from the cold hush of December to the brittle daylight dawn of January. And it carries with it a question that lingers long after the guns fall silent. What does it mean to endure when the world decides that your moment has come? Let us begin, not with a start, but with a pause. A moment to listen to the weather, to hear the distant rattle of a vehicle, to sense the tremor of fear and resolve that fills a cockpit, a foxhole, a farmhouse kitchen, and a command tent. This is the Battle of the Bulge, a winter trial that tested nations, units, and the simplest human impulse, to keep moving forward when the path seems blocked by the world itself. To grasp the Battle of the Bulge, one must understand the political and military nerve endings that connected it to the rest of the war. After the successful Allied breakout from Normandy in 1944 and a rapid advance across France and Belgium, Allied forces had pushed into the Low Countries and into Germany's occupied western fringes. The German war machine, strained by political pressures and fading stocks of fuel, faced a moment of bottleneck. To hold a line long enough to deter a decisive Allied push, or to gamble on a concentrated strike that could sever the Allied lines, disrupt their timetable, and force a negotiated settlement on more favorable terms. The decision-making circle in Berlin was filled with veterans of prior campaigns, men who understood how quickly momentum could shift in a war driven by logistics as much as by firepower. Adolf Hitler, who would be the infamous catalyst for many futile gambits, believed a sudden, formidable blow could sever Allied supply routes and create an opportunity for a political settlement that might avert a protracted war of attrition. He and his advisors chose the Ardennes as the theater for this audacious attempt, banking on a combination of surprise, weather, and a strategic misreading of Allied strength. On the Allied side, the Western Front had become a daunting but well-coordinated machine. American, British, and Commonwealth forces had learned to operate with a level of integration that, although evolving, allowed for rapid massing of firepower, superior air control, and a logistics system that could sustain an offensive over long distances. By mid-December 1944, however, some Allied units were riddled with weariness and stretched thin by the sheer tempo of operations since D-Day. The Allied command, the ETO, the Army Command, faced a crisis not only of arms but of perception. Would the enemy strike where and when they would least expect it? And could a winter offensive stall the Allied advance and threaten their hold on the most crucial sectors of Western Europe? The Ardennes terrain, with its dense forests, wrought iron hedgerows, and limited routes of approach, would become the logical stage for a battle that sought to exploit concealment, speed, and the surprise factor. It was a landscape that rewarded the attacker's ability to preserve momentum, to supply the advance through narrow corridors, and to withstand delays while maintaining the tempo that kept the enemy off balance. But the weather, often a protagonist in its own right, posed a unique risk to both sides. Snow and low clouds could ground air support, hamper reconnaissance, and complicate communications. Yet, a clear day could reveal the fragility of supply lines and the fragility of a front already stretched thin. The weather would thus oscillate between ally and adversary, shaping decisions, delaying reinforcements, and influencing the ultimate outcome. At the heart of the German plan lay a simple idea: strike through a weak point in the Allied line, create a salient that would draw Allied reserves into a fight on unfavorable ground, and then push deeper into Allied territory to disrupt industrial centers and supply routes. The operation required a deception of vast scale, the ideal combination of armored spearheads, mechanized infantry, and air support that could be mustered on short notice. The plan depended on time for the surprise to unfold, time for the weather to permit air reconnaissance and bombing, time to outpace any enemy response. In the months leading up to the attack, both sides prepared for what would become a defining moment. Allied intelligence sought to read the developing threat, but the Ardennes' quiet, its wooded interstices and quiet towns, made the enemy's intentions easy to misread. German spy networks, weather reports, and battle drills all intersected, forming a puzzle whose final picture would only emerge once the first shots rang out. And so, on December 16, 1944, the first shots of a battle that would live in memory as much for its weather and geography as for its tactical maneuvers were fired. The seals of the Ardennes would be broken, not by a single act of bravado, but by a sustained, exhausting effort to exploit a fragile moment in the Allied line. The early hours of the Bulge saw the German force strike with a blend of speed and surprise. They struck along multiple axes, north, central, and south, seeking to punch through the lines in a way that would cause Allied reserves to pivot inward, fracturing the front into a series of isolated pockets. The 5th Panzer Army, the 6th Panzer Army, and the 7th Army carved through the Ardennes, seeking to push toward Antwerp and the crucial ports that fed Allied logistics, while also threatening to sever the north-south rail and highway arteries that bound the front. The American line, composed of veteran units now stretched thinner than in the early days of the war, faced a formidable test. The weather initially masked the German thrust, allowing it to advance behind a veil of fog and snow. Some units scrambled to respond, rifle squads, tank destroyers, and armor that had not yet begun to fully cohere into a single strategy. Commanders at the tactical level faced a dilemma that would be familiar to any war. When speed is everything, what do you sacrifice to maintain a coherent defense? In the first days, the German forces achieved a measure of success by exploiting gaps in the Allied line and by using their armor to outpace replenishment efforts. The Americans, with their rapid, often improvised logistic practices, found themselves fighting in pockets where supply and fuel ran dangerously low. The image of the Bulge quickly became an emblem of attrition, a battle where endurance and the willingness to absorb hardship could, in some cases, outlast the enemy's initial advantage. Among the most telling scenes of the opening phase were the actions of the U.S. 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne, a town where the defense would become one of the most enduring symbols of Allied resilience in the war. Isolated and surrounded, Bastogne's troops faced a stark choice: hold their ground or risk a breakout that might unravel the entire Allied line. Their reply, delivered through the stubborn defense and a blunt admission to besieger questions, nuts, in a moment of laconic defiance, would become a beacon to Allies across the front. This early phase also highlighted the challenges of coordination under pressure. The German High Command sought to concentrate force and momentum, but German supply issues, fuel shortages, and the difficulty of maintaining a high tempo across a widening front gradually eroded the original plan. Meanwhile, Allied air power, constrained by weather, began its partial return in December, providing crucial reconnaissance and limited close air support that would grow as the front stabilized. In the north, the town of Mons and the corridor toward Liège became flashpoints as Allied forces attempted to hold the northern shoulder of the Bulge. At the same time, the southern flank near Luxembourg presented its own hazards, with supply lines that were perilously exposed to enemy activity and weather-induced delays. Each sector bore its own story, of small unit courage, of commanders improvising with what they had, and of a war economy that was being pushed to its absolute limit. As December gave way to January, the balance of the battle began to tilt. The arrival of reinforcements, American armor, artillery, and infantry units hastened to the Bulge's edges, began to restore cohesion to the Allied line. The Luftwaffe, initially able to operate in limited fashion due to fuel shortages and weather, found itself unable to sustain a prolonged air campaign. The skies, once a potential ally to Hitler's plan, increasingly favored Allied observation, bombing, and interdiction. The turning point came not from a single breakthrough, but from a shift in tempo. Allies refit, resupply, and reorganize amidst the remains of a shattered supply chain. Germans, despite initial gains, faced the reality of dwindling fuel and munitions. The momentum they had hoped to maintain would decay as the harsh arithmetic of war returned. Miles gained versus days of supply, progress measured against the cold reality of winter. In Bastogne, the press of time created a crucible for the Allied command. The defense of the town demanded a stubborn stamina, and the relief of Bastogne, led by General George S. Patton and the Third Army, came as a turning echo in the broader campaign. The fast-marching Third Army, conducting a northern pincer movement, began to tighten the noose around the Bulge's core, forcing German units to commit to a protracted fight instead of a rapid, decisive breakthrough. The relief of Bastogne is often cited as a defining moment, yet it was only one piece of a larger macro shift. The Allied command would push forward in multiple axes, cutting off German supply caravans, seizing key crossroads, and removing the operational space necessary for a sustained assault. The German defense, while heroic in many instances, could not sustain the edge it had achieved in those crucial first days. Meanwhile, the weather began to relent in parts of the front, enabling more robust air operations. Bombers could strike with greater reliability, and fighters could provide cover for ground forces, enabling resupply and the movement of reinforcements. The battle, which had begun as a dramatic feint, evolved into a slog, a long, grinding struggle in which the outcome would be decided not by one decisive stroke, but by relentless pressure applied across a broad front. Beyond the strategic calculus and the metal clang of armor, the Battle of the Bulge was a test of human endurance in the extreme. For the soldiers on the ground, the winter became a test of stamina, of staying warm with inadequate gear, of maintaining discipline under the constant threat of shellfire, and of keeping faith with one another when every mile of advance seemed to demand a sacrifice. For many, the only comfort was the presence of comrades whose training and shared experience gave the sense that they could endure what no map could predict. The infantryman's burden, carrying rations, ammunition, and the burden of fear, was not simply a matter of personal courage, but of group cohesion. Orders had to be understood and executed under harsh conditions, radio communications often obscured by static and interference, and leadership that had to balance swift action with prudent restraint. The weight of a decision could be measured in lives and the tempo of the front. The civilian experience in towns like Bastogne, Longwy, Saint-Vith, and Allied villages reveals another dimension of the battle: the fear of occupation, the disruption of daily life, and the improvised arrangements that ordinary people formed to endure. Civilians turned to cellar shelters, to makeshift clinics, to the quiet rituals of resilience that emerge when the front passes through a place and leaves a mark that cannot be erased by celebration or victory alone. Food, fuel, and shelter became the currency of survival. The struggle to maintain warmth, to access fuel reserves, and to secure a ration after ration cut by the shifting front created a parallel war, the war of provisioning, of logistics, that mattered as much as any battle plan. The Allied and German lines alike faced the moral and practical complexities of war in winter: how to protect civilians while prosecuting a difficult military objective, how to prevent excess hardship in villages that were stripped by conflicts and weather. Within the Allied ranks, the stress of the Bulge's early days prompted debates about strategy, supply, and command. These debates, preserved in diaries and dispatches, reveal commanders wrestling with the near-impossible tasks of keeping a broad front steady, while also exploiting any opportunities that a turn in the weather might provide. The human dimension of the battle, its fear, its resolve, its moments of quiet courage, constitutes a record of endurance that complements the more formal accounts of strategy and logistics. When the snow finally receded, the battlefield looked and sounded different. The Bulge had not achieved the strategic redirection Hitler had sought. Instead, it exposed the limits of Germany's capacity to wage war on two inexhaustible fronts. The Allied victory, though costly in lives and material, confirmed the momentum that would carry Western Europe toward liberation, and it marked the beginning of the end for the Axis on the Western Front. The human costs were grave on both sides. Casualties, wounded, missing in action, and the long-term scars left on veterans and civilians alike formed a ledger that no victory could fully erase. The Allied forces counted tens of thousands of men killed or wounded. The Germans suffered heavy losses in armor, infantry, and air resources, many of whom were pushed to the brink by the campaign's protracted nature and the harsh conditions of winter. In the aftermath, the Bulge reshaped Allied planning. It underscored the importance of flexible logistics, robust reserve forces, and the need for better weather forecasting and intelligence assessment in the planning of major operations. The battle also influenced the morale and political calculations of both sides as the war moved toward its closing chapters. If you made it this far, consider subscribing. Thank you for watching.